come closer to the fire, and let me tell you of the battle for Lion's Gate, of the Iron Warriors who came to tear down what Dorn had built, of the faithful who discovered that faith itself could be a weapon and a weakness, of ordinary soldiers who marched across a dying world, carrying a secret that would shake the foundations of the siege itself. This is the story of the first wall to truly face the fury of the Warmaster's legions. Not the outworks, not the outer defenses, but one of the great bastions of the Imperial Palace itself, the Lion's Gate spaceport. Picture it, if you will. A structure so vast it defied comprehension, a mountain of metal and stone that rose from the Katabatic plains like a challenge to the heavens themselves. Its guns could strike ships in orbit. Its void shields could weather bombardments that would level continents. Its garrison numbered in the hundreds of thousands, anchored by the golden sons of Rogal Dorn himself. The spaceport was more than a military installation. It was a statement of imperial might, a declaration that humanity would never again be confined to a single world. From its launch platforms, thousands of ships had departed for the stars during the Great Crusade. Through its receiving bays, the treasures of 1,000 conquered worlds had flowed into the Emperor's coffers. Now it was a fortress under siege. The Warmaster had sent his lesser sons against it first, the hordes of the lost and damned, the mutants and cultists who served as expendable fodder. They had broken against its walls like waves against a cliff, leaving behind tide mark of corpses that stretched for kilometers across the plains. Then the sons of Horus had come, elite warriors in sea-green armor, veterans of 100 campaigns. They had pushed further than any before them, reaching the outer bastions, fighting their way into the lower levels. But they too had been thrown back, their advance blunted by the stubborn resistance of the Imperial fists. Now Perturabo, the Lord of Iron, the master of siegecraft, had come to finish what Horus's lesser servants could not, and with him came the Iron Warriors, the legion that had broken more fortresses than any other, that had written the very treatises on siege warfare that the Imperium's commanders memorized like scripture. Kaidamor Forix had spent a lifetime learning the art of breaking fortresses. As first captain of the Iron Warriors, he had witnessed the fall of 1,000 strongholds, had calculated the precise amount of ordnance needed to breach any wall, had developed the tactics that turned impregnable defenses into smoking ruins. He knew the mathematics of destruction as intimately as a lover's face. But even he felt something like awe at the scale of what lay before him. A lifetime of war had inured Forix to the pound of heavy guns as much as it had the beating of his own hearts. Yet there was something majestic about the power unleashed onto the Imperial Palace by the Warmaster. The sky itself was blackened, a roiling storm of discharge and plasma, through which burning mass driver rounds crashed like meteors and beams of lance light strafed. Perturabo had unlocked the secrets of the Aegis that had warded the walls, exposing them to direct bombardment and assault. But the Lion's Gate spaceport remained shrouded in energy screens, its massive guns preventing warships from holding station directly overhead for fear of counter-bombardment. The assault would have to be ground-based, traditional. The kind of war the Iron Warriors had been bred to fight. Forix advanced with bolter in hand, a tide of soldiery and beasts around him. His auto-senses picked up the first distinctive cracks of the siege train loosing its wrath. A dozen kilometers behind him, battery after battery of cannons coughed forth a cloud of shells. The muzzle flare of their anger lit the skies, silhouetting their deadly rounds. A rolling thunder of noise followed, a shock wave that swept over the advancing legionaries and auxiliaries, bending banner poles, fluttering top knots on crusader helms, and washing over the unarmored masses with a hot wind that brought cries of astonishment and dismay. Men howled as eardrums split and sinuses burst. Those foolish enough to look upon the moment of firing left reeling as a flare brighter than the sun burned out their sight. Behind the advancing army, 3 siege towers rumbled forward, vast constructs of dark metal and bound daemon spirits, their weapons pounding the defenses into rubble. The Ordo Reductor of the Dark Mechanicum deployed engines of war that defied comprehension, walking fortresses and burrowing machines, and things that existed in geometries the human eye could not process. But the defenders were ready. Fafnir Ran, Lord Seneschal of the Imperial Fists, watched the approaching horde from the ramparts of the spaceport's outer defenses. He was a warrior bred for moments like this, savage in his joy, terrible in his fury, a killer among killers even in a legion of killers. "This is why we are here," he said to his brothers, his voice carrying over the thunder of the guns. "This is what we were created for." The first wave of traitors broke against the defenses like water against stone. 300,000 enemy dead in 2 hours was not a bad morning's work, Rand thought, watching the land speeders of his fast reserve chase down survivors across the corpse-carpeted plain. But it was only the beginning. Far from the walls of Lion's Gate, across the burning expanse of Terra, another army was making its way toward the battle. The trains had left Adaba 7 years after the first whispers of Horus's rebellion reached their ears. They carried the Adaba Defense Corps volunteers from the Downhive manufacturing complexes, men and women who had spent their lives building the tanks and weapons that now rolled toward the Imperial Palace. Adaba was a hive city in the Afric region, one of thousands of manufacturing centers that had been converted to wartime production when news of the Heresy first reached Terra. Its people had never seen the stars, had never walked beneath an open sky until the recruiters came. They knew the Emperor only as a distant figure, a name invoked by the overseers when quotas needed to be met, a symbol of the order that governed their lives. But they had built his weapons. Every tank that rolled off the assembly lines bore the touch of Adaban hands. Every las rifle, every artillery piece, every bolt of ammunition, all of it flowed from the manufactories that had consumed their lives and the lives of their ancestors for generations beyond counting. Zenobia had been a third-grade worker on the finishing line, spray-painting camouflage patterns on the hulls of battle tanks. She remembered the precise weight of the spray apparatus in her hands, the chemical smell of the paint, the way her arms ached after a 12-hour shift. She remembered the faces of her family, mother and father, aunts and uncles, cousins by the dozen, all of them working different stations on the same endless line. Her family had been fitters and finishers for generations, their lives measured in quotas and shift rotations, their world bounded by the walls of the nutrient complex where they lived and worked. They had never questioned this existence. It was simply the way things were, the natural order of the universe. When the recruiters had come, speaking of duty and sacrifice and the defense of the Emperor himself, her entire family had volunteered. Not out of patriotism, they had never seen the Emperor, never understood the wars that raged among the stars, but because the recruiters had made it clear that volunteering was the only alternative to conscription, and volunteers received better treatment. At least, that was what they had been told. The train journey had been a nightmare. Integrity officers prowled the carriages, conducting interviews that left some troopers shaken and others simply gone. The officers returned from their summons with expressions of guilty knowledge, and fewer of them came back than went up. "Where are the others?" Zenobia had asked, when 20 officers went up and only 15 came down. "Special duties," her cousin Menba had suggested, though even he didn't look convinced. Then they heard the gunshots from above. Sharp reports, muffled by the deck, but unmistakable. And when Captain Egwu descended to address the company, her face was tight with carefully controlled emotion. "The forces of War Master Horus have reached the solar system," the captain announced. "Naval and Legion fleets are engaged in void warfare against these flotillas at the gates near Pluto and Neptune. We have no further intelligence regarding the ongoing status of that battle, and we do not plan to provide a running commentary. The assumption from this moment forward is that Horus will, sooner or later, reach orbit over Terra and commence invasion." Zenobia had expected this news. Everyone had. But hearing the actual words set her heart racing. For a great part of her life she had been prepared for the coming battles, and to think that they were weeks, possibly even days from combat was exciting and terrifying, mostly terrifying the more she considered it. But it was tempered by the knot of duty she felt hard in her gut. She was no warrior-born, not a legionary, or even a proper soldier of the Imperial Army. But when the promise became reality, she would fight. For Adaba, for future generations, for the Emperor himself. The train had been attacked before they reached the palace. Armored figures in the darkness, bolt of fire and explosions, and then the desperate flight across the burning plains as the survivors scattered into the night. Zenobia remembered the moment the lights went out. The sudden darkness had sucked at her, leeching the last of her nerve from her body. Mixed shouts of panic and anger broke the stillness of the night. She had taken a step, twisted her ankle on a buried rock, and nearly fallen, and in that moment she had imagined the company surging forward, trampling over her in the moments of her fall. Sergeant Alexander had grabbed her coat, keeping her upright. He had been like that throughout the journey, always ahead, always watching, always there when someone stumbled. The train had started moving before everyone was aboard. Zenobia had pressed her face against the window, watching figures flowing between the wagons, heading to other trains on parallel sidings. She couldn't see but heard screams as some of them weren't quick enough, disappearing beneath the grinding metal of the wheels. Through the window, she could see groups of abandoned troopers silhouetted against the glimmer of lights on the horizon. Brighter flares flashed across the night, bolter rounds converging on the patches of darker shadow that were the troopers left behind. A sudden, stark flash of muzzle fire lit the distance, and a rapid-fire thunder drifted after the departing trains. In the instant before the explosion blinded her, she thought she had seen armored figures against the billow of flames. Legionaries in colors she did not recognize. The enemy had found them. They had walked for weeks after that. 500 kilometers through frozen wastelands and burning cities, through radiation storms and poison fog. The Himalayan plateau was a nightmare of ice and wind, where the temperature dropped so low that breath froze in the lungs and exposed skin turned black within minutes. They had eaten their dead when the rations ran out. It was Integrity Officer Tesfaye who had suggested it first, his voice flat and practical as he explained that the bodies would only slow them down otherwise. Some had refused. Those ones had died within days, their starving bodies unable to continue the march. They had fought off mutants and deserters and things that were no longer human at all. In the ruins of one abandoned way station, they had found evidence of a massacre, hundreds of bodies, torn apart by something with claws and teeth. The blood was still wet. And through it all, Zenobi had carried the company standard, a banner of gold and black that had grown tattered and stained but never fallen. It had become something more than cloth and metal to her. It was a symbol of everyone they had lost, everyone who had believed in the cause enough to die for it. "You've walked 5,000 kilometers, a tank commander asked her, when they finally encountered a loyalist armored column making its way toward the palace. "Feels like it," Menba replied, "but no. We had a train, but it was attacked. Been walking the last 500 kilometers or so." The tank commander stared at them with something like awe. That's impossible." But here they were, battered and broken, reduced to a fraction of their original strength, but still marching, still fighting, still believing in the cause they had sworn to serve, or so the defenders believed. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, another kind of battle was being fought, one that had nothing to do with guns and everything to do with faith. Katsuhiro had been a conscript on the outworks before the quarantine. He remembered the day they had pulled him from his work detail in the agridomes, handed him a lasgun, and marched him to the walls. He had never fired a weapon before that day. He had never seen a space marine, never witnessed the horrors that lurked in the shadows of the universe. He had learned quickly. The alternative was death. He had survived the Death Guard's poison attacks, watching his comrades choke on their own dissolving lungs while green-armored giants waded through the carnage, laughing at the screams. He had survived the Daemon incursions, when reality itself seemed to tear apart and things from nightmare came pouring through the gaps. He had survived the endless waves of lost and damned throwing themselves against the walls, killing until his hands shook and his dreams were nothing but blood and screaming. Now he stood guard in the Palatine Arc quarantine zone, watching for signs of corruption among the refugees who had fled the outer districts. It was quieter here, away from the walls, but the quiet was worse in some ways. It gave him time to think, time to remember, time to dream. The nightmare came to him every night. In it, he was a seed buried in rich earth, drinking in the decay of the world above. He felt himself rotting, becoming one with the loam, his flesh softening and breaking apart until he was nothing but nutrients for something vast and terrible that grew from his remains. He could feel roots pushing through his dissolving body, could sense the vast presence of the thing that fed on him, ancient and patient and utterly indifferent to his suffering. The strange thing was, the dream was not entirely unpleasant. There was a peace in it, a sense of becoming part of something larger than himself. The rot was warm, almost comforting, like sinking into a bath after a long day's work. It was not the dream that was the nightmare, but the waking. Every morning he opened his eyes expecting to find himself changed, expecting to see fungal growth spreading across his skin, expecting to feel the first stirrings of corruption in his gut. So far, the corruption had not come, but he knew it was only a matter of time. This night he was ripped from the embrace of the plant death by Chastain, barging into the dorm he shared with 50 other guards. All of them were veterans from outside. Nobody ever called it the first line or the outer defenses anymore. The outside was all they had to say. "I was on the outside, were you?" Even through the farts and snores, every man and woman woke at the loud footfalls of the new arrival, their senses keyed to any potential danger, a paranoia that even kilometers of high walls and gun towers would never set at ease for the rest of their lives. "Something's in the mess hall," Chastain told them. "Get your guns." They found light dancing across the kitchen walls, rippling over bare brick, seeping along the lines of mortar. Dust crumbled where it touched, each speck falling slowly, glinting like a tiny particle of light. Katsuhiro thought he saw an outline in the gathering motes. Instantly he thought of a man, beautiful and strong, an arm reached out toward the troopers. He heard Spilk snarl in disgust and the hum of an energy cell charging. "No!" Katsuhiro knocked his companion's lasgun upward as he pulled the trigger, the beam of red light blasting into the ceiling. Panicked shouts came from others, and a flurry of shots erupted along the kitchen, hiding the wall in a cloud of exploding brick dust. For a heartbeat longer, Katsuhiro saw a face amid the billowing specks, frown creased in disappointment, full lips pursed. Then it was gone. "By the forefathers, that was disgusting," muttered one of his squad mates, lip rippling in revulsion. But Katsuhiro was confused. The entity he had seen in the ghostlight had been anything but disgusting. The memory of it left an ache in his chest, longing for its return. The warp was touching Terra now, seeping through the cracks in the Emperor's psychic shield. And not all who saw its manifestations understood them as enemies. Euphrates Keeler understood. She had seen the truth of the warp years ago, aboard the Vengeful Spirit, when the Emperor's light had flowed through her and banished a daemon that threatened to consume her soul. She had been a remembrancer then, an artist tasked with documenting the glories of the Great Crusade for posterity. She had photographed the conquest of worlds, captured the faces of heroes, witnessed the birth of an empire that spanned the stars. Then she had seen the daemon, and everything had changed. The creature had come for her in the depths of the Warmaster's flagship, a thing of impossible angles and hungry eyes. It had whispered promises of power, of knowledge, of pleasures beyond mortal comprehension. It had shown her visions of the future, war and death and the fall of everything she had known. And then the Emperor's light had come, flowing through her like fire, burning the daemon away. In that moment she had felt the touch of something divine, something vast and ancient and utterly beyond human comprehension. She had known, with a certainty that defied all reason, that the Emperor was more than a man. He was a god, and she had been chosen to spread his word. She had written the words of the Lectitio Divinitatis, the scripture that proclaimed the Emperor's divinity. She had been imprisoned for her faith, interrogated by those who believed the imperial truth, that there were no gods, that religion was a weakness of primitive minds. She had been hunted by assassins sent by the very Warmaster whose ship had been her home. And yet she had survived, because the Emperor had more work for her to do. Now she walked among the faithful of Terra, spreading the word of the God Emperor to all who would listen. The siege had shattered the old certainties, had shown people that the universe was far more terrible than they had ever imagined. They needed something to believe in, something to hold on to in the darkness. She would give them that belief. "Rejoice, for I bring glorious news," the scripture began. God walks among us. The light-bearers were her most devoted followers, men and women who carried lamps through the darkness of the siege, who gathered in basilicas and abandoned temples to pray for the Emperor's protection. Their leader was a man named Olivier, who claimed to heal the sick and drive out corruption with the power of faith alone. Keeler was not sure she believed all his claims. But she could not deny the power she felt when she stood among the faithful, when their prayers rose like a chorus and the light of their lamps seemed to push back the darkness that gathered at the edges of perception. When she closed her eyes and let the faith carry her away, she found herself in a garden, a vast expanse of flowers and trees, beautiful beyond description. And at the center of that garden stood a tree so massive it held up the sky itself. The Emperor's tree, the manifestation of his will, his power, his protection over humanity. But the tree was under attack. Dark clouds gathered at its crown, crackling with malevolent lightning. The branches bent under a weight of shadow, and where that shadow touched, the bark blackened and rotted. The Chaos Gods were battering at the Emperor's defenses, and they were winning. Custodian Aemon Taromachian had been tasked with investigating the demonic incursions that plagued the palace. He was one of the Emperor's personal guardians, a warrior who had served for centuries, who remembered a time before the Imperium itself. He had walked these halls when they were still being built, when the palace was a dream taking shape in stone and metal. He had stood at the Emperor's side during the Unification Wars, had watched the Thunder Warriors sweep across Terra like a golden tide, crushing the tyrants and warlords who had ruled humanity's homeworld for millennia. He remembered Monarchia. The city had been raised in the Emperor's honor by the Word-Bearers Legion, a monument of worship and devotion, every building a shrine, every street a processional way. The people there had believed the Emperor was a god. They had prayed to him, sacrificed to him, built their entire civilization around the worship of his divine majesty. And the Emperor had ordered it destroyed. The Ultramarines had leveled the city to its foundations, while the Word-Bearers were forced to kneel in the ashes and watch. The message had been clear: there were no gods, and to worship the Emperor as one was the gravest of heresies. Ammon had agreed with that judgment then. He still believed the imperial truth had been the right path, that humanity's future lay in reason and science, not in the superstition and religious mania that had nearly destroyed the species during Old Night. But the evidence before him suggested that the universe was more complex than the imperial truth allowed. He had no love for the faith that Keeler preached, and yet he could not deny what he had seen, the power that flowed through her when she confronted the daemons, the way reality itself seemed to bend around her faith. She was not corrupted, not touched by chaos. If anything, she was the opposite, a vessel for something that burned the Neverborn like holy fire. Faith is growing in correlation to demonic presence, he reported to Captain General Valdor as they walked through the halls of the Senatorum Imperialis. I have yet to determine if there is causality, and in which direction. I do not deny my personal distaste for the misguided belief in the Emperor as a deity, but we cannot ignore the evidence. You propose to kill her? Valdor asked the question without sign of surprise or judgment. To be clear, yes, Captain General. If she is the source of the demonic breaches, they will end. If not, we have still curtailed the rise of a dangerous anti-imperial demagogue. They continued in silence for several minutes. Ammon knew not to prompt his superior for a reply, but instead reviewed his own plan for the execution should Valdor ask for it. They were almost at the gate into the halls when Valdor spoke. No, Keeler is not to be harmed. It was not in Ammon's nature to question the judgment of his superiors, but he could not hold back his question. What good do we achieve by letting her live? The enemy of my enemy. Valdor stopped. Horus sent an assassin after Keeler. Until she presents a provable threat to the immediate safety of the Emperor, I take guidance from that fact. If the renegades desire Keeler dead, I suggest to you that it is in our interest to keep her alive. It may well be for the very acts we see now that her assassination was ordered. I had not considered that, admitted Ammon. I will take command of the wider fight against the daemons, in concert with the Silent Sisterhood. But I need you to focus on the cause. Examine Keeler and the Lightbearers, and determine with certainty whether there is a connection between them and the Neverborn attacks. If there is, we will deal with it appropriately. If not, we can make use of them and spare ourselves the distraction. It was not the answer Ammon had expected, but he was a custodian, and custodians did not question the judgment of their superiors. He would watch, he would wait, and if Keeler proved to be a threat, he would deal with her regardless of what Valdor commanded. Back at Lion's Gate, the siege had entered a new phase, and Horus had led his hidden force deep into the spaceport's infrastructure, cutting through civilian resistance and Imperial Army cordons to reach the heart of the Stratofex core. The advance had not been wholly clandestine, was not meant to be. With the defenders unsure of the threat posed by the Iron Warriors, several scouting forces had been sent after them, each greeted by a sudden and overwhelming counterattack. The colonel, or whoever was in charge of the sector, had finally decided enough was enough and dispatched a company-level force to deal with the interlopers. 20 minutes had passed since the first shot had been fired, and more army personnel were being thrown into the fight. A few mortars and support guns had been brought to bear, frag bombs and armor-piercing shells forcing the Iron Warriors into a more defensive mode around the central Hab cluster. 811 warriors had made it to the rendezvous point, a nest of Hab dorms clustered around one of the main drop shafts. Civilians with autoguns and kitchen knives had proved less of an obstacle than the distance to cover, their bodies left cooling in the passageways and rooms they had called home. Horus felt nothing for the dead. They were obstacles, nothing more. The mathematics of war cared nothing for innocence or guilt, only for the equation of force and resistance, of objective and cost. The point of our attack is to open up a front inside the spaceport to allow the upper and lower forces to push forward in strength, he explained to Captain Garrel, as another enemy thrust along the passage to the east drew his eye. Scores of troopers in plated carapace armor led the fresh offensive, daring the bolter fusillade as they dashed from one doorway to the next. They'd lost half their number in the first 15 meters. Horus could not decide if they were brave or stupid to try a forced attack against his space marines. Probably both. These lackluster assaults will bog us down, but they aren't a significant commitment. Every bolt we have could kill a trooper and will achieve nothing. It is Dorn's sons that are the spine of this defense. I need to make sure the Imperial fists deploy in numbers against us. So what objective do we aim for? Send out 8 scouting forces, 10 legionaries each. I want even dispersal vertically and horizontally as far as they can go. Have each report levels of resistance every 200 meters. In particular, keep an eye out for our cousins in yellow. Any contact with Imperial fists must be signaled immediately. What are they seeking? Which of a force encounters the greatest increase in resistance is the one we shall follow. Horus allowed himself a thin smile. If you were defending the spaceport and you had enemy roaming at will, how would you organize your troops? I would assign defenders based on a scale of significance and vulnerability. The greater the value of a potential objective, the better defense. Garrel laughed as he reached his conclusion. The best defenses will be arrayed around the targets that are worth the most to our enemy. Exactly. It doesn't matter what we attack, only that the Imperial fists prize it highly. The more they fight to defend it, the greater its value to them. And when we have identified the target, we move in full force, Triarch, rapid spear point assault. We'll break the defense, seize whatever it is the Sons of Dawn are trying to protect, and then prepare ourselves for the counterattack. The greater their response, the better we're doing. It was the Iron Warrior's way. Not glory, not honor, just cold, calculated devastation, finding the weak points and exploiting them. Forcing the enemy to fight on terms of their choosing. Abaddon had come to Lion's Gate for his own reasons. There was a lot to be said for the simple pleasure of combat. The first captain of the Sons of Horus had always been a fighter, first and foremost. Born to be a king, he had chosen the road of battle rather than rulership, giving up that birthright to honor his bladekin. Now he waded through the defenders of the spaceport, his power fist wreathed in armor-shattering energy, his combi bolter roaring. This was purity. To be victorious and live, or to know defeat and death. A clear foe, a defined objective. But even as he fought, doubts gnawed at him. He had expected to feel brotherhood with those who fought beside him, Layak and his daemon-touched blade slaves, Kern and his blood-maddened world-eaters. Instead, he felt only disgust. He had helped bring this about, had heeded Erebus and the lodges, had embraced the rebellion when it seemed righteous. Now he wondered if they had simply traded one master for another, one tyranny for something far worse. Each time Horus fell into his warp trances, each time he communed with the powers in the Immaterium, he came back different, diminished somehow despite his growing power. He is not weakening, Layak had assured him. His affinity with the warp grows by the hour. His powers swell. But Abaddon had seen the truth. The War Master was no longer master of his own destiny. He was a vessel, a puppet, dancing to the tune of powers that cared nothing for the fate of humanity. That moment of reckoning would come. But not yet. Not while the war still hung in the balance. Then Rogal Dorn arrived. The Praetorian of Terror carved his way through the War Master's forces like a golden blade. Bolts and blades struck his armor without effect, while great sweeps of his chainsword dismembered and decapitated legionary after legionary, leaving a trail of bloodied armor plates and broken corpses in his wake. What had been a victorious final charge to drive the Imperial fists from the spaceport faltered in the face of the Emperor's son. Across the bridges, companies slowed in the advance, balked by the prospect of facing Dawn's wrath. Layak stepped forward, his blade slaves flanking him, a halo of power writhing about the tip of his staff. "It is not your time," he told Abaddon. "I see now that this moment was ordained for me long ago." The urge that had drawn Abaddon to push forward in support of Kern did not surface for Zardu Layak. He watched with detached interest as the priest conjured a gleaming hemisphere of power and advanced to take up position between the oncoming Primarch and the War Master's first captain. Layak's blade slaves dashed forward to confront Rogal Dorn. Wickedly serrated blades lashed at the arms and legs of the Primarch as the two attacked in unison, dodging the churning blades of Storm's teeth. Loosening the grip of one hand, Dorn swung a hammer-like fist, crushing the skull of a blade slave. It fought on for several more seconds, jerky and weak, until it fell backward and thrashed upon the floor. The air churned with power as Leyak attempted to summon the Neverborn. But the Emperor's shield still protected the port. No daemon could answer the word-bearer's summons. Then Abaddon felt something change, a hot wind rushing over him, emanating from somewhere within the palace itself. His skin prickled at the sensation, and his gut crawled at its touch, even as he saw the shapes of the Neverborn growing more substantial. The Emperor's protection was thinning, and across the palace, Euphrati Keeler was the reason why. She had led the Lightbearers to the Palatine Arc quarantine zone, to the very wall where Katsuhiro and his squad stood guard. 10,000 faithful followed her, their lamps bobbing in the darkness, their prayers rising like a hymn. "Let us slay the unworthy and protect the innocent," she said, her words carrying some distance along the firing line. Katsuhiro stepped back, shouldering his lasgun. The woman that led them came close to him, and the sight soothed away the anguish he had carried since the outside. She held a lantern made out of an artillery shell casing, but the light seemed to emanate from her pale skin as much as the lamp. "Who are you, Lady of Light?" he asked. An older man interposed himself between Katsuhiro and the pale figure. "She is the Holy Messenger, Trooper, blessed of the Emperor." Looking at her radiance against the darkness of the broken palaces, Katsuhiro could easily believe it. But Custodian Ammon saw something different. He saw the fly swarms gathering around the faithful, clustering thicker with every prayer. He saw the miasma seeping into the crowd, patches of darkness assuming humanoid shape before flowing back into formlessness. He saw the protective field that surrounded the Lightbearers, a field that deflected bolt rounds and forced gunships to break off their attack runs. The faithful believed they were channeling the Emperor's power. In truth, they were tearing holes in the Emperor's protection. Every prayer was a blade driven into the bark of the god tree. Every lamp was a beacon calling the daemons closer. Every act of worship was an act of sabotage, however unintentional. "Keeler," Ammon called, advancing through the swarm of flies. "You have to end this madness." Madness! I see only the faithful protecting themselves. He knew better than to argue. The demonic presence had cloaked itself in a garb of righteousness. Whatever Keeler witnessed was not the reality he observed. Energy crackled across the platform, the flies coating everything with furred black bodies, the buzzing drone enough to drive a listener insane. Then Olivier's eyes rolled back, black tears falling from the ducts to coat his cheeks in oily grime. He leapt at Ammon, his lunge met by the tip of the Guardian spear, which split his shoulder open. The blood that gushed from the injury bubbled with something unnatural. Ammon fired, 3 bolts direct to the tainted man's face, tearing apart the skull and brain. All around him, the faithful were transforming. The fog that had protected them was possessing them, turning them into vessels for the Neverborn. Their skin greyed, and their eyes rolled up as the cursed fog entered them, jaws lolling open, trails of saliva falling from slack lips. Only Keeler remained untouched, entombed within a sarcophagus of flies, her hands still gripping Cinderman's as she fought her own battle in the realm of spirit. Ammon leveled his guardian spear and took up a wide stance. The metal steps creaked as scores of tainted Lightbearers raced up them, pants and moans growing louder as they ascended. 19 more shots, and then he would be down to his blade alone. But across the palace, Keeler was winning her own fight. In the Garden of Faith, she had found herself drowning in a sea of corruption, pulled down by the weight of the prayers she had inspired. The faithful had become an anchor, dragging her and the Emperor's protection into the depths. But one chain still held her to the surface. She seized it, pulling herself up hand over hand, and saw the name inscribed on the link's Kirill Cinderman. It was his faith that saved her, pure and untainted, asking nothing in return. The faith of a man who had once been an iterator, a speaker of the imperial truth, who had seen that truth die and found something else to believe in. She pulled herself free of the corruption, and as she did, the daemon tide retreated. The flies dissolved into nothing. The possessed fell lifeless to the ground, and Ammon, who had been fighting alone against an endless horde, found himself standing in sudden silence. Keeler opened her eyes. She looked at the carnage around her, the bodies of those who had followed her, corrupted and destroyed by powers they had never understood. "The enemy uses our faith against us," she whispered. "But faith itself is not the enemy. Only faith without wisdom, only worship without understanding." Aemon said nothing, but he lowered his spear. The order to advance came at last. Zenobia and the Adaba Free Corps had reached the mustering point in the Himalaya, joining a mechanized column that would strike at the Lion's Gate spaceport from an unexpected angle. Lord Dorn himself had ordered the attack, a counter-offensive that would catch the Iron Warriors between two forces and break their hold on the spaceport once and for all. The excitement had rippled through the mustering base like a virus, moving from one camp to the next. For weeks they had waited in the mountain camps, eating donated rations, drilling with replacement weapons, watching the distant glow of the siege on the horizon. Now, finally, they would have their chance to fight. "The timing of the attack will be crucial," General Captain Egwu told her troops, standing atop one of the armored command transports that had been liberated from another formation. "This force will arrive along an axis that will turn the flank of the War Master's forces. A counterattack from within the palace will be mounted as the blow from this army falls, catching the Iron Warriors unawares." She paced along the roof of the vehicle, baton in hand, her voice amplified by the voxmeters below. "Lord Dorn has impressed upon the command staff the necessity of this attack. It is the engagement for which he has been waiting, one to which we have been delivered by fate to witness. The position of the Emperor's forces will be untenable if this attack fails." She paused, and Zenobia saw something strange in her expression. Pride, certainly, anticipation, but something else as well, something that looked almost like hunger. "Some of you will be detailed with special operational preparations. The remainder of the Free Corps will stand ready for my commands." Zenobia stood atop the command vehicle, the company standard in her hands. Around her, the smog of hundreds of engines blackened the sky, adding to the gloom of the filth-choked heavens. The thunder of tanks and transports created a deafening wave of sound that reverberated from the mountainsides. Everything was sudden movement, dust billowing from treads and boots alike. Electronic clarions howled into the whirl of noise, sounding the advance or stand to, their modulated calls overlapping. She thought of her family, lost somewhere in the ruins of Adaba. She thought of her comrades, the ones who had fallen during the long march, frozen in the mountain passes, starved on the endless plains, killed by mutants and deserters, and the countless other horrors that stalked the dying world. She thought of the Emperor, distant and unknowable, fighting his own battle against powers beyond human comprehension. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when all their sacrifice would be justified. The column began to move, and that was when Jawahir, the Integrity High Officer, gave the signal. Throughout the Adaba Free Corps, troopers who had kept their true allegiance hidden for 7 years reached for hidden weapons. Officers who had been carefully placed by the Integrity officers turned their guns on their own commanders. In every company, every platoon, the killing began quick and brutal, targeting those who had shown the strongest loyalty to the Emperor's cause. Zenobia watched in horror as her cousin Menba drew his sidearm and shot Captain Egwu in the back of the head. The General Captain's body tumbled from the command vehicle, her baton clattering across the metal roof. "For the true Emperor," Menba said, his voice flat and cold. "For the freedom of Adaba. For vengeance against the tyrant who destroyed our world." Zenobia couldn't move, couldn't speak. She could only stare at the man she had known her entire life, the cousin who had shared her rations and kept her warm during the freezing nights, who had carried her when her legs gave out on the mountain passes. "The Emperor destroyed Adaba long before the siege began," Menba continued, turning to face her. His eyes were empty, devoid of the warmth she remembered. "Our ancestors ruled those lands before unification. Our people were free. Then the Emperor came, with his thunder warriors and his promises of unity, and he ground our civilization into dust." She understood then. The Integrity officers had not been rooting out traitors. They had been identifying loyalists and eliminating them. The Adaba Free Corps had never been loyal to the Emperor. They had been waiting for this moment, the perfect opportunity to strike at the heart of Dawn's defenses. The column was not a relief force. It was a dagger aimed at the palace's back. Zenobia raised the company standard, her hands shaking. Around her, the Free Corps was turning on itself as those who had truly believed in the Emperor's cause fought against those who had been deceiving them all along. She didn't know what to do. Everything she had believed in was crumbling around her. The cause she had suffered for, the emperor she had been taught to worship, all of it was lies. Or was it? She looked at the standard in her hands. It was just cloth and metal, meaningless without the faith that gave it power. But she had carried it across 500 kilometers of hell. She had watched friends die defending it. She had believed in what it represented, even when belief seemed foolish. Maybe that was enough. Maybe faith didn't have to be about gods and emperors. Maybe it could be about the people beside you, the cause you chose to serve, the future you were willing to die for. Zenobia planted the standard in the roof of the command vehicle and drew her lasgun. She didn't know which side she was fighting for anymore. She only knew that she would fight. Far from the battle, in the wastes of the Khatumi desert, a man stepped from a crack in reality. He had short, dark hair, and his chin and cheeks were covered with recent growth, patches of silver in the black. His eyes were sunken with fatigue, his cheeks hollow. He wore a worker's coverall, a tattered backpack over one shoulder, a belt hung with many pouches about his waist. An old woman sat on a rock nearby, watching him with wide eyes. "Hello," he said, before a bout of coughing racked him. "Drink." She offered him a flask. "Just water." "Where am I?" She pointed toward a distant glow on the horizon, a hive city burning. "That was Adaba, oh." The man slumped, took a drink, and then straightened his shoulders. He nodded to the northeast. "The Imperial Palace is that way." "Yes, a long, long way." "You don't seem scared," he gestured to himself. "My arrival. Should I be?" She raised an eyebrow. "I've seen a lot these last weeks. My family taken by the Emperor, the sky burning, Adaba broken by light from the stars. So, a man that steps from the air. Not so dangerous, no." He laughed. "I suppose not." The man started walking away, heading toward the distant glow of the siege. "Who are you?" the woman called after him. "Are you with the War Master, the Emperor?" "No, I'm not one of Horus's servants." The man carried on walking, almost swallowed by the dust and night. His voice drifted back on the wind. "My name is John, and I'm on my own side." A heartbeat later, he was gone. John Grammaticus, the Perpetual, the man who could not die. He had played his games with empires and gods, had served powers he no longer believed in, had watched civilizations rise and fall across millennia. Now he was coming to Terra, to the battle that would decide the fate of humanity. He didn't know which side he would choose. He only knew that a choice would have to be made. The siege continued. Lion's Gate still stood, though its defenders had been pushed back to their final positions. The Iron Warriors had claimed the lower levels, but Dawn's counterattack had prevented them from breaking through to the spaceport's control centers. The battle had reached a stalemate, bloody and brutal, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Perturabo raged at the delay. He had expected to crack the spaceport open within days, to prove once and for all that his father's golden sons were no match for his iron will. Instead, he found himself fighting the kind of grinding attrition battle that he despised, not because it was difficult, but because it was wasteful. Every day the siege continued, more of his warriors fell. Every hour the defenders held, the War Master's timeline slipped further into jeopardy. But he would not relent. He had waited too long for this moment, had endured too many slights and humiliations at the hands of the Emperor and his favored sons. The palace would fall, the walls would crumble, and when the dust settled, everyone would know that it was Perturabo, not Horus, not any other, who had broken the greatest fortress in human history. Euphrati Keeler had learned the limits of faith. She still believed in the Emperor's divinity, still preached his word to all who would listen. But she understood now that faith without wisdom was a weapon that could be turned against the faithful. The daemons fed on worship as much as corruption. To defeat them, humanity would need more than prayers. She had felt the pull of the daemon tide, had nearly been dragged down by the weight of the faith she had inspired. Only Cinderman's pure devotion had saved her, his quiet belief, asking nothing in return, wanting only to serve. That was the lesson. Faith was not about power or glory or the hope of salvation. It was about connection to something greater than oneself, to the people beside you, to the future you were willing to die for. Custodian Ammon had learnt the limits of reason. He still distrusted the religion that Keeler preached, still believed that the imperial truth had been the right path, but he could not deny what he had seen, the power of faith to protect and destroy, to shield and to corrupt. The universe was more complex than he had imagined. Perhaps that was the real lesson of Monarchia, not that worship was wrong, but that the Emperor had feared what it might become. He had seen the dangers of faith untempered by wisdom, had known that humanity's need to believe could be exploited by powers that cared nothing for human welfare. The word-bearers had proven him right, but that did not mean all faith was corrupt. Katsuhiro had learnt to live with his dreams. The plant death still came to him every night, but he no longer feared it. He understood now that corruption was not inevitable, that the touch of the warp did not doom a soul to damnation. He could feel the pull of something vast and terrible, and he could choose to resist it. That choice was what made him human. Not the absence of temptation, but the strength to refuse it. And somewhere in the ruins of the Adaba Free Corps, Zenobi had learned that loyalty was not about flags or emperors. It was about the choice you made when everything you believed in turned out to be a lie. She had made her choice. She would fight for the people beside her, the ones who had suffered with her across the long march. She would fight for the future, whatever shape it might take. Not because she believed in the Emperor's divinity, not because she trusted in the righteousness of his cause, but because some things were worth fighting for regardless of who sat upon the golden throne, and when the battle was over, if she survived, she would find new things to believe in. The first wall had been tested. It had bent, but it had not broken. There would be harder tests to come. The full fury of the War Master had yet to be unleashed. Primarchs would fall, and legends would be born. The fate of humanity itself hung in the balance. But for now, in this moment, the defenders held. Sleep now, if you can. Let the sound of distant guns fade into silence, the screams of the dying become whispers on the wind. Dream of walls that stand against the darkness, of ordinary people who find extraordinary courage when everything seems lost. Dream of faith, not the blind worship that opens doors for daemons, but the quiet certainty that some things are worth fighting for, even when you cannot see the end. The siege continues, the walls still stand, and somewhere in the darkness, a man named John is walking toward a destiny that even he cannot foresee. Until next time.